Good morning to you, good friends. I want to talk to you this morning about preaching. Preaching has got a very bad reputation amongst many people today. A teenager might say to its parents, "Stop preaching at me." It would be considered a serious mistake on the part of the parents if they were to treat their youngster in a preachy kind of way. George Eliot, the author, once described her own secret of getting through a really bad sermon. The first thing to do, she wrote, is to enjoy the end of the sermon, which is not difficult because the agony is over. Then it's necessary to appreciate the middle of the sermon because that's halfway to the end. It's eventually possible to be reconciled to the beginning of the sermon because having started, it must logically progress towards the middle and the end. Now, sometimes preachers don't help themselves. They make it worse by saying to their congregation things like, "I won't keep you long," or "You won't want to listen to me." Surely no one sent by God should ever begin their introduction like that. All of these views on preaching are in stark contrast to the way that God views the work of the preacher. He has one son, and he made him a preacher. There's no greater task in all the world in the mind of God. Preaching is one of the ways in which God gets through to the mind, heart, soul, and will. The Apostle Paul outlines the logic lying behind the work of the preacher. It's in our reading today from Romans chapter 10 and verse 14. How can someone pray to someone that they don't believe in? That's question number one. Well, obviously they wouldn't think of doing it, is the simple answer. Question number two. So how can someone believe in someone that they don't know about? Well, again, obviously they won't. Question number three. How can they know about God unless someone tells them? They can't. And that's the work of the preacher, to tell them so that they will know and they will believe and then they will pray. That was precisely my experience over 60 years ago. I can still see the preacher, the Reverend David Abernethy, standing in the pulpit with his arms outstretched, describing the way that Jesus had been nailed to a cross because of the things that I had done wrong, and in order to bring forgiveness to me through his death. That image has never left me. It was God's way of getting some important spiritual truth through to my mind, my heart, my soul, and my will. I wonder, are you able to remember any sermon where God got through to you in that way? Where you found yourself illuminated, instructed, challenged, motivated, comforted, strengthened, or something else? If you have, then you're well aware of what I'm talking about today. Preaching is one of God's means of grace, one of his ways of getting through to us. Not only did God make his son into a preacher of unparalleled effectiveness, but his preaching, most particularly the Sermon on the Mount, has been described as the most sublime preaching ever proclaimed. Yet preaching wasn't intended to begin and end with Jesus. He ensured that there was proper succession planning. He sent out his own disciples to preach. He commanded that we, their successors, should also preach the gospel in our own generation. Paul rather quaintly quotes a verse from Isaiah. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. In ancient times, news was carried by runners, sometimes working in relays. If the news was good, then the feet which carried the message were considered to be especially lovely. So, next Sunday, after you've listened to the preacher, ask if you can have a look at their feet. But just a moment. Like George Eliot, we've all heard some pretty awful sermons in our time. Is every sermon a message from God? Are all preachers messengers of God? Are we to listen to them all with equal attention and seriousness? As a matter of fact, the Bible gives us some clear instructions about the ways in which we are to test the preacher to see if they really are speaking on God's behalf. Test number one is this: do they practice what they preach? Jesus told his congregation not to listen to some of the religious leaders of his day, particularly the Pharisees, because he said they do not practice what they preach. He said about them that their religion was all for show. Everything they do, he said, is done for men to see. You can't listen to them. Charles Spurgeon, the Baptist preacher, described a fellow minister who preached so well and lived so badly that when he was in the pulpit, everyone said he ought never to come out again. And when he was out of it, they all declared he never ought to enter it again. Check your preacher for consistency. That's the integrity test. Test number 2 is this: who are they preaching about? Sometimes we hear the very disturbing comment at the conclusion of a sermon: he never mentioned God or Jesus once in the whole 20 minutes. Now, the primary purpose of any sermon is to bring the reality of God alive into the hearts and minds of our hearers. Nothing else matters. James Stewart, a famous Scottish preacher, put it like this: that the purpose of the preacher is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God, to feed the mind with the truth of God, to purge the imagination by the beauty of God, to open the heart to the love of God, to devote the will to the purpose of God. The pulpit is the most dangerous place in the world. And one of the biggest dangers for a preacher is that they end up preaching themselves rather than Jesus. They draw attention to themselves. And even when they speak of God, it's only to turn people's eyes back to themselves. It's such a well-known pitfall that Paul says of himself that he's been careful to avoid such a mistake. We do not preach ourselves, he writes, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. So check your preacher for content. Are they preaching about Jesus or about themselves? That's the focus test. Here's test number 3. Are they preaching the Bible? Our congregations do not need to hear the opinions of the preacher. They need to hear the opinions of God, particularly when the opinions of the preacher may be at odds with the opinions of God. In ancient times, there was a massive difference between the message which was being preached by Jeremiah as a prophet of God and the other prophets in Israel at the time. Jeremiah was saying to the people that they needed to repent of the serious sinfulness which had infected the whole nation. He went on to say that if they repented and got themselves right with God again, then they might possibly avoid the judgment which was about to come upon the nation. However, at the same time, there was a group of other preachers who were going around and contradicting everything that Jeremiah was saying. What's new? They told the people that they were fine as they were, that they could ignore Jeremiah and that nothing needed to change. So who was right? They couldn't both be right because they were saying opposing things. One was preaching their own opinions and one was preaching the opinions of God. But which was which? God resolved the uncertainty for the people in two ways. First of all, he gave this assessment of the false prophets. He said, they dress the wounds of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. They're wrong. Secondly, because the people listened to the wrong prophets, God sent the judgment that Jeremiah had said was on the way. Check your preacher for subject. Are they preaching their own views or God's views? This is the faithfulness test. Test number 4. Are they preaching the Bible correctly? There are those who say that you can get the Bible to prove anything that you want. That simply isn't true. But what is true is that some preachers manipulate the Bible in order to get it to say what they want it to say. This is nothing new. Right from the very beginning of the church, there have been people who've tried to change the basic message of Jesus. Sometimes it's been a result of a particular emphasis in the Christian faith, which has got out of hand and become predominant over everything else. Sometimes the preacher has wanted to make it easier for people to believe. Sometimes they've tried to ingratiate themselves with their hearers. Sometimes they've done it for the sake of money. It's the responsibility of the person who listens to each sermon to listen with a critical mind, not in order to criticize, but in order to be sure that what they are hearing is really what the Bible has to say. When Paul was evangelizing in Greece, he visited a town called Berea, which had a Jewish community. He told them about Jesus, the Messiah. And we read this about the people there. The Bereans were of noble character, and they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Check your preacher for misrepresenting the Bible. Are they saying what it actually says or what they want it to say? This is the truth test. Preaching. It's another way that God gets through to the mind, the heart, the soul, and the will. May you hear his voice still more clearly in the years ahead when you listen to faithful ministers preaching in his name. And by the way, hang on for a moment for me to show you my feet. God bless you.